everyone. Good afternoon from all of us at Samvad. There are very many familiar faces, very many friendly faces and names, which is always delightful for us. So Samvad is, of course, familiar to most of you, but for anyone who on this group is a newcomer, Samvad is a national initiative on child protection and mental health. We are located at NIMHANS, that is the National Institute of Mental Health and Neurosciences at Bangalore. And we've been established by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, the Government of India, to reach out to service providers, stakeholders, primarily in the thematic areas of child mental health, child protection, education, and policy and law. A very warm welcome to all of you to this afternoon's session on this Netflix series called Adolescence. As we put out in our message, we had so many requests to do a discussion on this, and rightly so. There's a lot to say on this series. A few introductions and then some housekeeping announcements on how we will proceed in this session. So to my right is Dr. Shekhar Sheshadri, advisor, Samvad, former senior professor, child and adolescent psychiatry. To my further right is Professor and Dr. John Vijaysagar, head of Department of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry. And then I have on both sides of me Saurabh and Shubham, who are on our policy and law team. My name is Sheila and I'm the team lead for Samvad. So with that introduction, on the housekeeping issues, since we expect a lot of people to join this session, and in order to be as equitable, egalitarian, and democratic as possible, your unmute function has been unfortunately disabled. I know that's a little disappointing, but the idea is for everyone to be able to use chat that would allow everyone to say as much as they would like, to express themselves freely and contribute their thoughts and ideas to the session and allow for everyone else to read them. How we will proceed is as follows. I will do a 2-minute summary on the Adolescence series itself. That will be followed by some background information and clarification of adolescent terminology, essentially, to provide some clarity as we move through the session. And then we will come to the meat of the discussion. We have curated a few themes and sub-themes that broadly look at some of the critical elements of the series, and that I hope will allow us to bring forward all the thoughts that we have had over recent weeks. But of course, you are welcome to throw as many themes and sub-themes as you have been thinking about in recent times. So I hope that's all right. Now, for a very quick summary, I think most people on this have watched the series, but for a few people who may not have done so yet, Adolescence is about Jamie Miller, a 13-year-old who has been apprehended by the juvenile justice system in UK, which is where the series is set, for the murder of another adolescent girl who he was allegedly bullied by. So the first episode begins quite dramatically, and I think there's been some criticism, perhaps not so accurately, on how the police sort of barge into Jamie's house at 6 a.m. and much to the dismay, distress, and shock of his family and of himself, and apprehend him, and the procedures thereafter at the police station. The second episode is about the police and the detectives' visit to Jamie's school, their interactions with some of his classmates, his friends, the victim's best friend, as they try to glean more information on what transpired, how things happened. This is also an episode where some of the terms that Saurabh and Shubham will be clarifying at the outset are thrown up, such as manosphere and incel, and some of these new terminologies that all of us are having to wrap our heads around, internet and cyber-related terminologies that our adolescents quite comfortably use. The third episode, perhaps the most dramatic and gripping of them all, shows us this whole interview, a very intense interaction between the psychologist and Jamie. The psychologist visits him at the residential home where he's been placed 7 months after the murder took place. And the psychologist interviews him to really understand what his understanding is of the events that transpired. So she tries to unpack perceptions that he has about himself, about his social world, about issues such as the manosphere, his responses to bullying, and so on and so forth. We'll be discussing all that in detail. And finally, the last episode that takes us back to Jamie's home and the heartbreakingly distressing lives that his parents continue to lead, and his sister, as they grieve his loss to the system and try and process all that has happened to the family, not to mention the stigma and so on that they continue to contend with months on in the neighborhood in which they live. So with that, let's proceed to some of the terms that we'd like to clarify, and that include some of the philosophies that pervade the world of adolescence today. So, Saurabh and Shubham.
Yeah, I'll start. So the first term that we wanted to discuss, and we'll be having greater discussions on why these terms are relevant in terms of how children get onto, say, for example, if you're discussing a term like manosphere, how children become a part of the manosphere. These are all things that we'll be discussing later on in the discussion itself, but just so that we are on the same plane of understanding while referencing to certain terms during the course of the discussion, we thought it will be very suitable to go ahead and first introduce some of these concepts because they can have very different, confusing meanings for a lot of us. So therefore, these are some terms that we wanted to present to you. The first term is the term incel. Now, when we go to the term, when we think about the term incel, actually the roots of the term are very, very innocent in nature. They actually originated in the 80s and the late 80s at the very advent of the internet and personal usage of the internet per se. It was by a blogger who essentially wanted to collect experiences of people who felt that who felt socially awkward, who felt that they did not possess the necessary social skills to go ahead and interact with people of the opposite sex or people that they were attracted to, as a result of which they did not have very highly functional or highly, or at least they did not have very did not have sexual experiences or did not have sexual relationships that they could meaningfully talk about or they could meaningfully be happy about. But however, with time, this transgressed into some sinister meanings as well. Particularly in the late 2010s, with the advent of social media, particularly certain forums like Reddit, which are based on the institution, which are based on the pillars of anonymity. What essentially ended up happening is that this term incel started being used on the internet to refer to actually men, particularly young men, started referring to themselves as incels, who also tended to have extremely misogynistic and extremely polarized views about their own sex and about their own sexuality and how they are being treated in the larger how they are essentially being treated in larger society, right? So essentially, the term incel is essentially comprises of three main constructs that the whole community of the subculture believe in, and these are essentially, firstly, that there is an appearance-based hierarchy in the world. In particularly the societies that they live in, there's an appearance-based hierarchy where there is conventional appearance, and therefore one who is conventionally more quote unquote prettier or quote unquote more handsome is somebody who is often higher up in the hierarchy, and they are the ones who actually get to form most. They are the ones who actually go ahead and get to have the most amount of sexual experiences. A similar linked concept that they also believe in is the fact that there is a concept, there is widespread female hypergamy, which is the notion that women are too sexually selective, and they use their sexual privilege to go ahead and um, use it for their social and professional advancement above anything else. Right. So that is the second construct, second widely held construct that the whole incel community believes in. And the last but not the least, obviously, they absolutely hate any form of political women's rights discourse, movements, and also extremely hate feminism, both in the larger political context and also in regular daily day-to-day conversations or day-to-day interactions. That any notion of feminism is something that they wish to tackle and wish to bring down, right? So that is largely what the incel community, the concepts that they believe in. The incels essentially feel that they are sexually undesirable, that they don't have any place in society, as a result of which, and there are constructs like the 80-20 rule, where they believe that 80% of where they believe that 80% of women are actually attracted to only 20% of the men, and therefore they will invariably, because they either lack the conventional attractiveness or they do not possess the necessary social skills to attract women. Therefore, they are likely to go ahead and be involuntary celibates all throughout their life, right? So that is essentially the core construct of the core meaning of what incel and the incel subculture is. Um, that brings us to the related concept of manosphere, but both concepts are a little distinct, largely because the manosphere is a larger subset of this, a larger subset of which, a larger set of which incel and incelhood is a part of, is a subset of. Manosphere is essentially a combination or a collection of websites, online forums, and other forms of media which are easily accessible online, which basically go ahead and propagate the theory that today's social and cultural norms essentially place men in such a position wherein they are extremely they underprivileged, wherein they don't have the privilege and luxuries that they should have as men, and therefore they hate that fact. They feel that a lot of it has the developments of the last 20 to 30 years, including a greater emphasis on human rights and a greater emphasis on feminism and a greater emphasis on political correctness, has essentially led them to a place wherein they cannot simply go ahead and discuss. They cannot simply go ahead and claim what they feel is a birthright, particularly with sense to biological essentialism, wherein the fact that because of certain biological traits that men have, because of which they are far superior to women, or they are unable to basically go ahead and access power and access privilege because of the fact that women have essentially put them down and they don't have the opportunities anymore. So that is essentially manosphere. Now the manosphere exists in the conventional web, which is still to an extent monitored and still something that people can go ahead and call out. Say, for example, manosphere groups that are existing on Reddit, manosphere groups that are existing on Instagram, Facebook, etc. These are still quite monitorable. However, there is a concept of dark web and deep web as well, right? And essentially, most of the conversation, most of the forums, most of the websites that are a part of the manosphere, which essentially propagate extreme misogynism and particularly very violent misogynism at that, are actually available on the dark web and subsequently on the deep web as well, which are absolutely unmonitored and unregulated, and however very easily accessed by everybody, including adolescents and children as well, right? So that is largely the concept of the manosphere. The third thing that we wanted to talk about is the use of emojis while conversing through text. Um, I'm sure a lot of you might have seen most of you have seen the show, and you have come to know about how certain very innocent looking emojis have actually very deep meaning in the world of in the incel slash manosphere world that these children occupy, or these children are part of. However, what we want to also make a point of is that um, depending on the culture, depending on certain online communities, the meaning of these emojis might actually differ from sub community to another community, right? Therefore, it is if someone says that this is an authoritative list of emojis and what they imply, that will not always be the case, because depending on certain other subcultures or sub communities, the same emoji might mean something else. And also, please try to understand, for those who know that whatever they are doing and the ideas that they're spewing are inherently criminal in nature, they will try to go ahead and keep changing the lexicon of emojis as well, so that they are not traced and they are not as highly regulated, right? Therefore, these emojis, while they do have contextual meanings, like, say, for example, the red pill, which essentially is drawn from the Matrix movie, for whoever has seen the movie. And it means that if you take the red pill, you have made the choice to see the hard truth, right? And that is something which is used by manosphere groups to actually say, okay, it is used by manospheres to actually spew very hateful ideas about women, but they use the red pill to say, okay, this is actually the truth which people in society are trying to hide from you. Right. So essentially, so therefore, there are multiple such emojis which are used, and some of them are referred to in the show as well. But we have to be cautious, because in not all subcultures do these emojis mean the same thing. Then I'll leave it to Saurav to also discuss a couple of other themes that we are other terms that we wanted to.
I, Before Saurabh started, I just wanted to say that I'm making note of all the posts that are already coming on chat. So thank you, Sandeep and Radhika, lovely Ashika, Deepanjali, and Venkat. So we're keeping note of that, and we'll come to it as we take each of the points you put down in the latter part of the discussion. Saurabh?
Yeah. Some of these points are actually quite interesting to be returning to them, because they deal with some of the issues that we'll be speaking about today in terms of socialization. There's some of these platforms, the role of validation, the role of parents and intergenerational, family dynamics in the wake of these platforms, and really where is quote unquote the blame to lie, if any, and we'll return to some of these, but just to provide a little more context apart from what Shubham has already outlined for us. There are a couple of things, in keeping with this manosphere and what we know about inceldom, and all of this. We now come to the actual players, so to speak, on these platforms, right? The people like Andrew Tate, who's also referenced in the Netflix show as well, and is a name that has significant popularity even in India, which is ironic because Andrew Tate, as an influencer, this is actually a former kickboxer, a reputed kickboxer who then transitioned to becoming an online influencer, and initially began with conversations surrounding how you can become successful, motivational, health related, fitness related, success related, the classic self-help sort of lie that is sold to quite a lot of people, and that was the initial positioning. But over time, his content slowly descended into questionable and progressively very, very misogynistic content about women, essentially, right? And he became increasingly popular after that. But when we speak about people like this, so the players who are responsible for creating and pushing this content, we also need to understand why they are so popular, and we'll have to discuss some of that in today's session as well. But the basic premise that a lot of these influencers, and certainly we shouldn't be mistaken in thinking that these influencers only exist out of the country, despite the fact that they usually have large followings in countries like India. Andrew Tate himself is quite popular here, even after having on record made relatively racist statements about Indians. But that doesn't matter, because a lot of the other content is content that people believe in. But apart from people like Andrew Tate who are also popular here, there are also homegrown influencers of the same ilk, other people on platforms such as Instagram and so on YouTube and many other platforms, who also post content that is extremely problematic. There have been, many of these people show up on quite popular TV shows in the country. You have people like Elvish Yadav and many others who have on multiple occasions been found to say objectionable things. But what is so destructive about these objectionable things, and we'll come to discussing some of that. Why is this so destructive? If it's just someone saying something objectionable, which there may be in other sources of the internet, why does this have such a pernicious impact on young minds? And that's really the heart of why some of these people play quite a big role in this manosphere ecosystem that Shubham was talking about. Typically, before we go into some of the nuances of it, the basic premise is that they don't only talk about derogatory beliefs about women. They don't only talk about their sexist beliefs. The entire conversation doesn't only surround misogyny. It's typically framed along with other things, like men's health, fitness, how to look good. It's embedded in other aspects of life on social media platforms that people do care about. So increasingly, if you're an adolescent on these social media platforms, you do care about how to be fitter. You do care about how to eventually make more money because you're being told that this is extremely important. You do care about all of these aspects, and you want someone to tell you how to get better at this. And in that context, what role does someone like Andrew Tate play is quite important, right? And finally, of course, just to provide a little bit of context before we return to this in our discussion as well, the law itself, right? And this is an important point to make. Of course, we see the not just online impact of the radicalization, so to speak, but that there was a clear, a real world impact in terms of the crime of murder. And that's been reported in a few cases now in terms of sexual crimes as well as other kinds of violent crime. And typically in these cases, because they shock the public conscience, they also raise a lot of anger, they raise a lot of questions. They are met with typically very strong punitive responses. In the UK, for example, we saw that in Jamie's case, where he was subsequently sent to the adult system, and he was likely to spend a majority of his life, or at least a big part of his life, in prison, right? Because that is the nature of the UK system. If you are a child who's been accused of an offense that is not very serious, you will be tried within the juvenile system. But if you are a child who's been accused of a very serious offense, then you will be sent to Crown Court, which is essentially where you will be tried like an adult, right? And there you could be receive an initial sentence of say 12 or 13 years, following which there may be a review of your sentence to see whether you should be released on probation, or you may spend another 10-15 years in jail. So there are significant penal consequences even for young children who commit violent offenses. And in India as well, we have, some of you, have been on our training programs. You know that we also have a similar system under the Juvenile Justice Act in terms of juvenile transfer for 16 to 18-year-olds who are accused of committing heinous offenses or offenses for which the minimum imprisonment is more than 7 years. And here as well, children can be subject to extremely long sentences depending on the final decision of the courts. So there are implications to some of these offenses that shock the public conscience. But as we'll discuss today, what are some of the key aspects of children's engagement, adolescents' engagement with social media platforms? What are some of the key issues in terms of radicalization and the imperatives for de-radicalization? And how do we negotiate some of this when we look at the juvenile systems or the strict legal systems that have to necessarily hold even very young children accountable for what are very serious crimes? So, Shubham, do you want to just begin with the first? Maybe?
Yeah, I think we'll take a few responses. Let's do a few responses to what's out there and then move into the themes.
So I'll quickly address some of the things that many of you have brought on chat, and thank you very much for the interest that you're showing. And I believe that all of us, all 165 of us who are on this session, have seen the series. Let me start with what Dr. Sandeep Nayak says about the father's anger on the one hand, apparent anger on the one hand, and social media on the other hand. Is this blame on the father really justified? as the cause for the aggression and misogyny that Jamie showed. And in fact, this actually comes up in the discussion in the third episode when the psychologist is actually probing into the father and the grandfather and the family's issues and so on. The point, Sandeep and friends, is not, it's not either or. I think that the combination of both the kind of role models that you may have on the one hand and the kind of messages that come on social media about men and women, about relationships, uh, and then the kind of anomie or the normlessness which seems to form a significant part of young people's lives is really responsible for how these things manifest. Radhika, her first issue was about the importance of validation, as shown in the film, and we all know that from a therapeutic stance, validation of some of the vulnerabilities and insecurities of people who come into conflict with authority, or what we refer to now as justice involved youth, is a very important part of the restorative uh, justice practice rather than the retributive practice. So, if you are looking at rehabilitation, reformation, and restoration, then validation becomes a very important part. But Radhika also speaks about the inner voice of Jamie, of the police, of Jamie's parents, of the sister, and of classmates. And that would be an interesting exercise to do. In fact, the father's inner voice comes quite often to say, wait, what did we do? Or could I have done anything so that this didn't happen? Lovely goes on to talk about how Jamie says that when she was unconscious, I didn't touch her, and raises the question on how masculinity is defined. Is it just the restraint in certain conditions, but otherwise you can manifest all the positions of entitlement? In fact, Michael Kaufman and Michael Kimmel, who speak about masculinity, often say it is not about the experience of absolute power, because while in a gendered patriarchal society, men may exercise and experience power over women, it is also true that men have power over other men based on caste and class and other forms of exclusion. And they say that masculinity is more about the experience of entitlement rather than the absolute experience, in addition to other dimensions. Yashika, we couldn't agree more with you about the deep impact that the third episode has, and we'll come into the third episode in a little more detail because this whole business of what has often been referred to as constructive confrontation, when one works with quote perpetrators unquote, is a very significant aspect of therapeutic work where transformation of people who are perpetrators actually takes place.
I wanted to add to that aspect. I see your question is how do you then work in a therapy session with children who may sometimes express strong opinions that don't necessarily resonate with those that we hold. I think it's an extension of what the psychologist was doing even here. It is to maintain a non-judgmental attitude, but to push the questions. And when I say push, I don't mean in a harsh or difficult way, but continue to ask the questions. This is also what we refer to as the Socratic method, where questions are asked in a manner to allow children to reflect, in fact, to get them to reflect. So the questions could be provocative, but they are more reflective in nature. What would happen if? But why this? Why do you think so? Has something ever happened to make you feel so? What we are doing is getting the child to go deeper and deeper into a given issue or into his or her own mind, to delve into it, to understand what he or she is actually thinking. And by doing so, and we also use examples, stories, analogies. There are many ways in which we do this. So you present not just the child situation, in fact, to go beyond it, to present other analogies and examples. so that eventually what we are actually doing is to create what we call a cognitive dissonance. What that essentially means is to create a certain kind of confusion in the child's mind to say, this is what I believed all along, but wait a minute, that's what she's saying. I'm not sure. That space of dissonance and confusion is what offers us an opportunity to shift the child's thinking eventually. That's what we are working towards. Go ahead.
Well, Dr. Deepanjali has actually raised two issues. One about how come all the children in the school appear to have this demeanor of dismissal and cruelty? Is there something that is happening in our school cultures? And the school as an institution, does it really engender a culture of being self-oriented and self-serving rather than a culture of compassion? And in fact, her second question later is when Jamie says, I've done nothing wrong, as though Katie deserved it. Where do all these ideas about life, about people, about entitlement comes from? And this is actually related to an issue that Dr. Mirza has raised about the school as a milieu that engenders toxic masculinity. In fact, Dr. Mirza and friends, it would not surprise you to know that Dr. Krishna Kumar, who was the chairperson of NCRT, on one of the most respected voices in the field of education, says schools must be counter socializers. If in general society patriarchy, masculinity plays out in such a ways, school is the place where you give counter argument to look at a more compassionate, a more just, a more equitable world, a more egalitarian world. And when that discussion doesn't take place and the school itself is hierarchical, oppressive, and patriarchal, where even women teachers in the pecking order come, somewhere between an administrative system which is not just patriarchal but is a manifestation of hegemony. It becomes a very great problem.
I also wanted to add to the culture of schools. I had a couple more thoughts to share. It's interesting how the culture that a school creates and the way in which it creates it may not be all that different from what the internet is doing. Because there is actually in schools also a strong element of selection. The school is defining, for example, success, what success should look like, what successful students look like, and who they are. If you go and ask any class, who are the successful students, and they'll point to X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and that'll be a handful of kids. And invariably, schools do it in a manner to reduce and restrict the identity of students to grades, marks, which is well known, but also to other obvious areas of talent, such as, I don't know, sports, basketball, music, dance. There are some fairly, if you look at what the school defines in terms of talent, it is some specific things, and quite limited to the arts, etc. While that may be legitimate, friends, I'd like you to consider the following. The vast majority of us, I think, don't necessarily have any one of those talents. So, if I'm not gifted in terms of music or art or sport, what am I left with? Who am I then? And how, what space do I occupy in school? And how does the school treat me? So the question is not about those 10 or 15 people who are very obviously talented and are recognized for it. It's about the vast majority, and then where do they look to for meaning, for identity? And I think a lot of the children, I'm not saying that those who are talented don't fall into this whole toxic culture issue. Of course they do. But I think it is the vast majority that's outside of this subgroup that are so drawn towards anything else that gives their life some sort of meaning and gives them some importance or a sense of belonging, which otherwise a school does not offer.
There is, of course, in continuation of what Sheila was saying, and the issue that Venkat Reddy actually brought forth, that the school as a milieu and the kind of institutional cultures that schools have, and Venkat makes a very telling observation that even the teachers are insulting, a negative attitude even towards younger children, and how therefore your whether you're personable or not, a lot of differences is made by the way you observe people relating to and behaving with each other. The fact that Minu brings out, everybody does it as a justification. If you really look at the modified social stress model about the risk of any behavior, stress and or distress plus normalization. Uh, Normalization is the extent to which a behavior is justified because everybody is doing it. It becomes part of the subculture. But Minu raises a very interesting point, and that point is, what if the psychologist had been a man? And does gender play a role in the selection of therapists? This is a question which most of us in mental health have been sort of contending with. In certain cases, does the gender of the therapist make a difference? And we will come to this discussion in a bit. If you really look at the third episode, and if you look at some of Jamie's behaviors, there was part of Jamie's behaviors that was extremely flirtatious. Other than there were three aspects of his behavior, all indicative of his vulnerability. But this actually leads to another question that Radhika has raised. That is, the series does not lay blame squarely on anyone. And this is the point, friends, that we wish to make. In conflict resolution, trying to simplify to a linear cause-effect relationship does not work. One has to recognize the complexity and constellation of things involved and address each of them if resolution is to take place, including what Vishnu has put down as peer influence and how peer influence is balanced between what happens at home and what happens during adolescence, where peers become more important in your scheme of things. So, do parents really have a culture of conversations with children on life, on relationships, on compassion, on arousal, on sexuality, on conflicts, on anger, on objectivity, on fairness? Do we really have these discussions in a nuanced way, so that when a child is in a situation of conflict, there is something to draw upon and respond, rather than something coming from what you've gleaned from the peer group and from social media, adding on to your own impulsivity and the bullying and the exclusion that takes place, adding to the vulnerabilities coming from the incel and the manosphere cultures that exist in the virtual world today.
Just to take on from Dr. Shekhar's point, and I think this is also a question a couple of people had. I think, as Minu had mentioned, just if everybody does it, is it right for a child or adolescent, simply because there is this idea that they're still developing, they're still forming their identity, and how much leeway really can we give children just because there are bad cultures? Should we hold adolescents to a higher standard, even if there are bad cultures? Should there be some requirement to take ownership over their actions? I want all of us to just take a second and think about what it was like in high school. How many people really wanted to stand out? How many of us really wanted to stand out in high school? How many people wanted to fit in more than anything else? And there were fixed criteria, and I think Sheila and Dr. Shekhar have discussed some of those, and Shubham had mentioned initially as well, that schools are effectively a petri dish of society, right? They represent the same thing. So if society values very shallow beauty standards, then the school values shallow beauty standards. If society values different forms of segregation and discrimination, then the school also values different forms of segregation and discrimination. Children can't be expected to provide the emancipatory space that all of society has failed to do so, right? And if we consider that for a second, it's not the question that's useful to us if we care about how do we reduce or mitigate or stop some of this in the future is perhaps not, is this justified? Because adolescents typically don't care about the question. The question they care about is, how can I make my life easier if I'm being regularly bullied in the school? Or how can I reach the top of the social pyramid if I have the chance to, if I'm good at sports, or I'm just generally very mischievous and I have the wrong kind of reputation in class, or I'm very disruptive and my friends think I'm a little bit of a legend with the teachers, or I generally excel at both academics and extracurricular activities, and so that gives me another path. That's what the adolescent cares about. Realistically, you care about acceptance, you care about social capital. These are the objectives. So if someone is asking me, did you think you were justified in doing what you did, I don't even care about that question as an adolescent. And so when we consider some of this, we do need to really look at what that developmental period is like for an adolescent, what that developmental period engenders in terms of priorities in that adolescent's life, and therefore where do we need to intervene in line with their priorities without expecting what is otherwise not possible.
That also resonates, Shubham, with the other issue that Dr. Mirza Ka has pointed out, this whole issue of validating some of their skills and abilities. And what Mirza has put down is heartbreaking, this life of shame that... so the question of value, in fact, Lev Vygotsky, the social constructive psychologist, often says if that the school has to be a collaborative community where knowledge is jointly constructed. And he spoke about a theory of value, the term that Dr. Mirza has used, value. How does a child feel valued? And even for a child who presents a report card to a parent who says, "What nonsense is this?" or "You're a useless fellow," or "When will you ever improve?" We have often found both for internally directed aggression, which is self-harm, or externally directed aggression. One of the things is when you have been devalued, or you have no personal sense of value, then you act out, because in any case you'd been told that the value that you have as a human being has been compromised. And I think somewhere Jamie's bullying experiences, his rejection perhaps to an effort that he made to befriend Katie or anyone else, contributed deeply to his sense of insecurity and vulnerability, leading on the one hand to extreme distress and on the other hand to extreme anger. And the combination of extreme distress and extreme anger is a volatile combination in terms of how it renders the thinking processes awry.
Just adding on to what Dr. Shekhar just mentioned, I think one of the major things that we saw, and I think someone harped upon it as well, the fact that Jamie feels that there's something that he should be good at, right? And that is where I think a lot of this rejection and the lack of self-esteem is something where it comes in, right? A lot of the things that traditionally that an adolescent, a male adolescent would like to do, or a man would like to do, are things that Jamie has always had a tough time doing, right? When his father put him to play football, he did not succeed at it. Something which is deeply masculine and something which is considered to be deeply masculine did not succeed at it. As Dr. Shekhar referenced to, the very fact that he was rejected by Katie, the very fact that he did not feel like he only had friends who also had social anxieties, particularly when it comes to the opposite sex and feeling sexually valued as well, right? So at that point in time, the child starts internalizing certain percepts around, or at least internalizes or at least feels this emotion of deep frustration. And that is where I think social media also comes in, because then social media is a platform. Because at the end of the day, he does have a very counter socialization, an extent, a degree of counter socialization from his family. But the fact that he has social media, and that social media has silos like the manosphere, which goes ahead and subcultures like the incel culture, which goes ahead and then validates and gives more meaning and more reasons as to why is he feeling this way, what is the cause of his frustration. And then therefore that meaning is something that was what he gets from that subculture. He starts feeling validated by that subculture because others are also feeling the same thing as he is, and that's how the echo chamber starts getting created.
We can move into the themes now. Why don't you?
Do you want to begin, Shubha? I think we can discuss, and we've already discussed some of this, but the question of socialization, I think a lot of the questions related to what role is social media playing in adolescents' lives. Is it really, I think the first question itself was, is it really fair to blame or lay blame at the father's feet when social media plays such a significant role in shaping beliefs, perceptions of adolescents? So maybe we can discuss that a little bit to understand, what really does social media mean for adolescents, and why is it so important? Why is content on this so important? And maybe just to begin our discussion there, I think in addition to what we've already said, that social media is very much exists as another kind of public space that children occupy, and therefore has strong relations with the real world in terms of the same conveying of prejudices, in the terms of the same kind of difficult trends that we see in schools. The fact that bullying continues in schools throughout the country, the fact that schools, as opposed to being the emancipatory places that they are, more often than not tend to reiterate problematic ideas, beliefs, thoughts, expressions, so on. When you look at all of this, and then you also look at social media not as a separate silo, but rather as an extension, albeit a different kind of extension, it gives us a little bit of insight. Because you have this reality that we see in the real world, but you also have fundamentally a different architecture. And I think that's an important point for all of us to just consider for a second, that social media is not just the real world online. Social media is the real world online mediated by algorithmic preferences, right? And so who really is shaping the architecture of the social media? It's certainly not me, you, or even the government, right? It's private entities with a certain objective, typically related to profit related motives. And within that context, given the public function that these kind of social media platforms serve, what are the imperatives for regulating conversation, discussion, participation on these platforms? Has that even been considered in the architecture of these platforms itself? There's been a lot of research, but if I had to put it very briefly for the purposes of today's discussion, there's been research that's found that algorithms thrive on improving engagement, right? These social media platforms, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, or so on, they thrive on improving engagement. They want more people to be more active on these platforms. And the way they think they can get more people to be more active on these platforms is by showing people content that is likely to evoke a strong emotional response in us. Because they don't think that nuanced, balanced thoughts are going to really make me keep scrolling or keep using that particular platform. But if I keep scrolling, then the company benefits, right? If I keep scrolling, it's probably because I strongly agree or I strongly disagree, right? And that's kind of the polarizing nature of these platforms themselves. So what happens when you take young children who are still developing a sense of identity, as we've been discussing today, right? They're still developing their perceptions and beliefs. Nothing is set in stone. And then you give them a very polarized platform where they spend a lot of their time. Suddenly, they're being socialized into a world that doesn't have too much space for discussion and nuance. They're being socialized online to a world that only has space for strong agreement or strong disagreement, which also means that the problematic beliefs that exist in the real world and society that we talked about today are mapped onto those extremes. So there's either extremely progressive ideas or there's extremely regressive ideas. And depending on who you are, you might be asked to make a choice. And so as a young adolescent male, I'm asked to choose if I want to support the unreasonable agendas of my female classmates, or whether I want to navigate and accept the reality of men's troubles and male victimhood that Shubham had spoken about a little while ago. I have to choose. And the odd thing about social media, because of the architecture of this public space, is that being exposed to oppositional views or views that I disagree with doesn't make me feel like there is an opportunity for learning. It simply means that this is an attack on what I believe, and one that must be taken down swiftly. So I just want us to keep this context in mind, and think about this in our work with adolescents, because I do think that the fundamentally changed architecture of the online world, when it's mapped out onto the real world's issues in terms of discrimination, sexism, so on, has very different kinds of implications, right? Because it's a different kind of interaction.
I just wanted to link what Saurav just spoke about with a couple of other issues that have been raised on chat. When Elena refers to dogmas, particularly beliefs centered around masculinity, is masculinity a spontaneous thing that occurs through a series of unfolding, or is it a precarious thing that you have to achieve at all odds? And why cannot masculinity be consistent with the theme of tenderness, and with the theme of an egalitarian and an aesthetic worldview? Now, interestingly, Dr. Bhushan Shukla raises the whole question, and it's a very interesting question, idea, Bhushan, that is the school ecosystem changing in such a way that it's predominantly women teachers, counselors, that it's mainly women who are gravitating towards the education? And are there really compassionate role models in the form of men within the educational ecosystem, both the counseling system and the teaching system? And is there something there that we really need to address? And this is why the issues that Harvandan has raised about a sense of uniqueness that a child can face in a school, and how schools can then um, be, as Krishna Kumar points out, as a counter socializer, to the point that Saro made earlier, that how can we expect schools to be any different than what is playing out and happening in civil society? There are two other issues that I want to raise before I take note of everything else that has been put on chat. Um, Radhika has again raised the issue of boundaries, both personal and professional, in the way that some of the activities played out. But Samita has also raised a very interesting point, which is not sort of central to the movie itself, but it's about the filming, and was it right to use a 13-year-old? Samita and friends, I wanted to say that other than adolescence and the interest it has created internationally, the movie, if one looks at movie craft or filming craft, as you know, all the episodes were a single shot. They used drones, and though it was shot many times, in the fourth episode, it was the 16th shot that was finally taken. Another episode, it was the fifth shot. But each episode is shot as a single. It's a single shot each episode. Now, unlike in India, where the National Commission of Protection of Child Rights has taken a serious view about reality shows and how children break down because they're insulted by judges and so on. Filming with children has very serious guidelines and ethics and so on. Now, as far as some of the other films that Samvad has used in its work, a lot of the shots that involve, let's say, sexuality and so on. For example, we use a film called The Tale, which is about grooming. The shots that involve the girl in explicit scenes are actually a body double, which is an adult. So they have very strict rules about how many hours the child can shoot, that assistance is available, parental consent is taken, and so on. So there are ethics of filming with children, particularly where serious themes are concerned. And I'm sure that those ethical standards would have been adhered to in the way that the child actor, incidentally, I think was 14 or 15 years old when it was shot, though he played a 13-year-old, but he was already 15 when the movie was filmed.
Yeah. I just want to make another point. I think this has come up as well. The point that Dr. Sandeep Naik again has made, with regard to children, very young children having unsupervised access to social media platforms and the internet, and a lot of children already being indoctrinated in schools, which potentially, of course, lead to extremely tragic events like this. But then, how do we really address this? Is one therapy session enough? Certainly, the short answer would be no. One therapy session is usually inadequate for almost any kind of issue in that regard. But I think speaking to the larger point, when we look at what children are facing, right, and let's take a step back from the discussion on just social media. When children are receiving narratives, as opposed to just reacting to narratives, there has to be an alternative narrative as well, right? And the problem right now is that, especially in the Indian context, because parents and schools and basically every person in charge is unwilling to have a conversation about sex and sexuality, what it means to be an adolescent growing up today when you have access to information. You know that there's another 14-year-old in a different part of the world who probably doesn't have the same strict rules that you do. What does that do to your aspirations, your desires, your wants, your needs, right? Growing up in that particular world, if no one around me is willing to have a conversation about things that are difficult to talk about, then I will go somewhere else for my information. And I think recognizing that there needs to be alternative narratives, that the solution to maybe the toxic narratives about gender norms, about male versus female roles, about sex and sexuality, about women as possessions, the alternative has to be that, that conversations about healthy relationships, conversations about what, the issues with preconceived notions about gender norms. There needs to be some alternate conversation. And the problem, I think, to some extent, which also feeds into these questions of inceldom and the lonely aspects of the manosphere, is that there is little to no other conversation to replace or to even hold a mirror to the toxic kind of conversations that exist in the manosphere.
The Varsha raises an important question. Do schools really have the capacity to deal with the increasing complex world that we live in and the increasingly complex world of adolescence, the increasingly complex world of the digital changes that are occurring with AI on the one hand, and can we really expect schools to have the bandwidth to deal with this? But I suppose, as you know, as Samvad, as we come from a public child mental health perspective, and since education is a very major vertical, we believe that conscientizing, to borrow a phrase from Paulo Freire, would be an important aspect. And I think it's a question of re-envisioning what schools are all about and what education is all about, to embrace these new realities and completely look at the nature of conversations that take place in schools. If this has to be done, I'm particularly referring to what Vijeta Chauhan has asked as a psychologist. If you want to really use all these ideas, how do we do this? I want to say, friends, that whenever we do sessions, we always look at the intent, content, methodology, and process paradigm. So, in a given session or a series of sessions, what is our intent? Is it to unpack masculinity? Is it to build this very evocative term that Dr. Mirza uses, the roots of empathy? What a beautiful term. Can we sow the roots of empathy very early in school itself? So, is that our intent? And then in the content, we look at all these: incel, manosphere, digital world, social media, relationships, arousal, desire, consent, exclusion, vulnerability, anger. All this is content. The methodology can be debate, discussion, watching a film, doing small group work, writing stories, building a story, role play, and so on. And then we process it. What is happening here? What do we understand from this? How else could this situation have been resolved? Are there other ways and other perspectives that help us take a more nuanced and a more beneficial orientation towards the situation at hand? And then we also look at meta processing in the next session to say, remember what we discussed the last time. Did anything happen this week that reminded you of our discussion, and you exercised a new way of thinking or a new way of responding, which sort of allowed the new conflict that emerged to be resolved in a much better way than it would have hitherto happened if we had not done the session. So it's this kind of methodology that's really important to keep in mind.
And I think that's linked to Radhika's comment on how the writer and director of the film made a very important choice of not showing, certain types of vulnerabilities like parents engaging in drug abuse or a dysfunctional family, separation or school dropout or socioeconomics, etc. I think that's a very critical point. I think the film makes the point very strongly that while conventional adversities or adverse childhood experiences certainly, play a role in understanding child offending behaviors. I don't think we can any longer restrict ourselves to that. So all the seminal literature on adverse childhood circumstances remains true, but there are new vulnerabilities emerging. So all the stuff we are talking about in terms of social media, in terms of the concepts that children are learning or the ideologies that they are learning via their social networks, via social media, these are the additional things we need to be looking into moving forward. So this has implications for how we do mental health and psychosocial assessments. And if you look at the third episode of the series, therein lies the importance. How do you get to know a child's social world? How do you get to know his or her perceptions of people, of friends, of issues? Who are the child's role models? We really need to know all of these things before understanding what happened, why it happened, and then subsequently what to do or what to address in our interventions. So I think the time has come to reformat our assessments and to broaden them, to deepen our understanding of an individual child in a scenario like this.
Dr. Lal and Khyati have raised an interesting issue about Jamie's relationship with the sister and the mother. But I just wanted to say that, sometimes, and I'm sort of using this word with a little trepidation. Sometimes quote pathology unquote can be very circumscribed. It doesn't necessarily play out in every aspect of a human being's engagement with a certain constituency or a community. So misogyny itself may not play out in all relationships. And someone interestingly, pointed out in one of these social medias that I thought about, men justifying sexual violence based on the fact that they were under the influence of alcohol. And this activist said, when you drink alcohol, do you go and sleep with your mother or your sister? You don't. And so where does restraint or consciousness come at that point of time? How is it that it manifests in non-familial and circumstances which do not relate to filial relationships and the objectionality therein? So some of these ideas in relationships actually about relationships play out in very circumscribed, kind of fashion. Also, Indra and Mirza, coming back to the point that you raised about schools' roles and expectations, and Dr. Mirza is alluding even to what Tagore said about what education should all be about. Uh, the NEP is a very complex document, and I just want to bring to your notice that if you really navigate NEP, other than whatever it says about co-education, there are at least 30 or 40 areas in NEP that directly refer to children's well-being and mental health. So I think it is time that all of us who are present here in this session and who work with families, who work with children, and who work with systems, use our resources in the position that we have to exert that influence on the schools in our neighborhood or the schools that we are associated with, to build an ecosystem that looks at education from a completely different lens and a completely different perspective.
Right. There are several other interesting comments which we are sure that you are reading, and the purpose was for everyone to share their thoughts, for other people to think them through. With that, let's delve into the second theme, which I think would be of much interest, on mental health frameworks to understand children engaging in violent crime. This takes us specifically to the third episode of the series, the psychologist's interactions with Jamie. But of course, you can broaden it as you like. So we invite you to share your thoughts both on that episode, but larger issues you think we should be thinking about when we look at children in conflict with the law, especially those who engage in violent crime.
And while you're thinking, just to sort of recapitulate some of the points that have been made, sort of, you can just scroll. Yeah. Can we, okay, about the adolescent girls whose, whose social lives are completely determined whether they are not picked up by a boy, how pretty they are, and so on. Nina David's point about when working with young people, especially in the post-COVID sort of, do we have a sense of personal alienation that young clients refer to, and the absence of meaningful connections? We did refer to Enomi in the past, and life skills deficits that have been alluded to by Radhika, and Maushami, who speaks, who's a fresh graduate, and Maushami, we are going to be discussing about the third episode because it's very critical for practitioners, and we are waiting very eagerly for posts on chat. Alina again speaks about adolescent girls, which I've already alluded to. Yashika speaks about some countries around banning social media, at least for part of the adolescents. And I think this is an important political decision that has taken place. And Dr. Varsha speaks about curriculum on social media. So basically the etiquette around use of or responsible use of the social media.
Yeah, I think Saurabh and I were actually discussing this morning about all these many guidelines and so on that exist for parents, for children to, regulate how they use social media and so on. But I think the reality of it is, are we really going to place the burden of how to use social media, how to control it, to what extent they can use it, etc., on children and on parents when, recall what Saurabh mentioned about systems. Saurabh, you want to reiterate
Yeah,
the
I
issue
think
of systems and how, what we are contending with,
Yeah.
what children and parents are up against, and how tame sometimes, I mean, not to sound cynical, but how workable or feasible are all these guidelines in the wake of these tyrannical systems?
Yeah, I think we can, to the point that Sheila just raised, we can also relate it back to a couple of the points on the feasibility of banning children's access to social media because they are interlinked. A lot of these conversations around limiting access or banning children's access to social media has come from concerns relating to their safe participation, the harms caused to them, or the harms that they potentially cause to others through these platforms. And at some level there have been more conversations, and I think a lot of these came up particularly during the pandemic. Certainly there was a lot of attention given to that because there was more scope for unstructured time to be spent on a number of these platforms, and also because you had classes online, you had to actually spend a lot of time online. And so the question has become to some degree about how parents can play more of an active role in ensuring that, like any other space, children don't have unguided, unsupervised, unstructured time on a landscape that many of us still don't fully understand, right? If the question is about supervision, that implies that the problem only lies in unstructured use of these platforms. But the question that we perhaps need to ask is, are there issues with any kind of use of these platforms? Right? And that's there's been a fair amount of research on that we already previously discussed to say that these platforms encourage a certain kind of use. They also encourage you to consume content that typically you agree with, or content that you want to see more, that is evokes a stronger emotional response. In light of all of this, is supervised time on social media platforms or on any of these new technologies by parents going to actually stop the inherently harmful impacts of the way these platforms work? The answer perhaps no. And so the question then is, from a systemic perspective, how do we ensure that these platforms are better regulated? Right? Because the simple fact is, if we just consider India alone, all of these platforms have millions of users from just our country. That gives the government, right, a lot of ability to potentially negotiate with these social media platforms and see from a systemic perspective what some of the changes that can be requested to the very design architecture of these platforms. And that's the point I made earlier, that platforms are not designed in neutral ways. Platforms are designed to facilitate what is beneficial to the company. And so it's designed to facilitate continuous use, it's designed to facilitate continuous engagement. The platform is not overtly concerned about what kind of continuous engagement it's facilitating. And so if the company is working from its own perspective, how can the government then ensure that, given the importance of these spaces, these digital spaces, that there are rules about how algorithms can be designed, how what kind of content can be pushed, what kind of age verification procedures can be brought in, so that even if the algorithm works one way for adults, it is necessitated to work differently for children, right?
Just to add on to what's quickly add on to what Saurabh said, I request everyone to kindly go ahead and read this if you can. UK was one of the countries which recently, I think last year or so, actually came up with a universal code, which is to say that all platforms, which essentially social media platforms or any platform wherein children and adolescents are able to engage with each other or with with people at large, all of these platforms need to be based on a certain, particularly when they are to deal with children, their coding has to be of a universal nature wherein there are certain agreed tenets. For example, the fact that for example, as Saurav was mentioning, algorithms, right? There are algorithms which push children into a certain direction. So what the universal code means is that no matter whichever platform it is, be it Facebook, be it X, be it any other platform or Reddit, they have to ensure that if, say, for example, a child or an adolescent is being a part of or getting into an algorithm which has a lot of toxic and a lot of criminal activity or a lot of violent activity or violent messaging that is happening, then immediately they have to cut down that child access to such an online forum, right? Because it is built on common agreements on certain tenets of child safety and child protection, which are inviolable, and all ISPs who want to actually internet service providers who actually want to operate in the UK have to follow this common code when it comes to designing any form of technology for children and adolescents at large. Also, quickly coming to the question of banning as well, right? Please, let's understand the fact that in this today's era, children or adolescents or no matter whoever it is, if you ban social media on, see, the government only has powers literally only over the normal web that we are all familiar to. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of the iceberg which is submerged is in the dark and the deep web. At a point in time, you ban children's and adolescents' access to actually relatively safer online platforms as opposed to those that exist on the dark and the deep web. You are actually pushing children to go ahead and access dark and deep web for their social interactions in an era where digital socialization is considered to be a norm by children, and a lot of them don't even consider it to be any different from in-person socialization, right? And particularly in a country like India, where in a lot of rural households, for example, there is the only way in which particularly parents and adults actually, because of low levels of digital literacy, actually access the digital economy is through their child and adolescent support, right? Therefore, banning social media actually has no practical use, any form of practical utility, because the child anyway is the person who's using their father's phone or their mother's phone to access the digital economy. Similarly, in a household where there's only one phone amongst 4 or 5 different family members, it becomes very easy for the child to access social media, even if you say, oh, from tomorrow, no one under the age of 18 can actually go ahead and access the social media, and we'll do a proper photo verification and all of that. Even if that doesn't matter, because your brother will be 23 years old and you'll be using his phone to actually access the social media. Therefore, these are also considerations that we need to figure into when we talk about banning social media for adolescents and children.
So a lot has been said on the social media, and I see that there are 20, 30 responses in and around social media, around schools, and so on. And we wanted to really come to the second theme, essentially about the mental health frameworks to understand children engaging in violent crimes, and particularly about the third episode. And there are several questions that have come up. One was when he asked, "Do you really like me as a person? What should she have said?" Other was, "Why did the psychologist cry at a certain point of time? And is that um, is that all right, or can we understand the context of that crying in a better sense?" And so there are a couple of things I wanted to share about this whole approach of constructive confrontation. If you actually see episode 3 again, as some of us did, saw it several times to really look at the kind of techniques that she uses to try and elicit what aspect of psychological thinking and its contextual origins were behind what Jamie did. So the question is, not what happened, but why did he do it? Because it was fairly established through the video evidence. And so the whole premise of the series is based on this understanding. And I think Radhika has actually said repeatedly that no one is actually blamed, but many aspects are raised. But what the psychologist does in episode 3 is she looks to see whether there are toxic masculine role models, the father's anger, the fact that he trashed a shed, once. Was that a one-off incident? Was there intergenerational transfer of this idea of patriarchy and masculinity and violence when she spoke about the grandfather? She speaks about sex and sexuality to really look at whether there are contexts of vulnerability there, and so on. So there are a whole series of things that she does to look at all possible origins of what might have happened that explains Jamie's behavior. And I think that a listing of the kind of areas that she touched on are important as a technique to be used whenever we work with justice involved youth, to see how best we can assist them in their transformation or in any restorative or reformative process.
Sonali ma'am says, I wonder, while watching the series, whether it was the right way to deal with a 13-year-old student who was going through a lot until he committed the crime. It's a very interesting question. Was it the right way to deal in terms of what was portrayed? If you're referring to the initial part in the first episode, in terms of how the justice system was portrayed as dealing with the 13-year-old, I guess not. And I think people in India will hotly argue, the judicial system particularly, that things are never done or rarely done in this manner in our country. And I don't think it's done that way in their country. So I'm not so sure about the accuracy of breaking down a door and, at 6 a.m. in the morning and so aggressively apprehending the child. That wouldn't be the way to go. And like I said, I'm not sure of the accuracy. But if you're referring then thereafter to the psychologist interview, the question is, at different stages, who is dealing with the child and in what capacity? Because you have people who, in our country, we don't have these specialties. As you know, we are a low resource country with mental health and legal professionals performing very similar roles, sometimes overlapping roles. But in countries like the UK, where there is, much smaller countries, highly specialized roles, where you'll have a forensic interviewer who would have interviewed Jamie only to ask what happened and what he did. They are not particularly interested in the why of it. They're looking to get the facts of the case and what really happened, because to look at it from a legal perspective. Thereafter, you have this kind of psychologist, like Brioni was, the one you saw, where she's looking at just understanding why Jamie did what he did, because she's trying to make a pre-sentencing report to the judge. So trying to get an understanding of his understanding. She is not his therapist. So these roles are not to be confused. And if you recall, towards the end, she said, I advise you to, make the most of whatever mental health interventions, etc., are offered to you. So in a situation like the UK, of what this series presented, it appears that there would be the mental health professional could be of more than one type. They come in at different points and they have different functions. And that's possibly why when, but you said, why did Brioni cry? Perhaps, her job was not to engage in therapy or to provide great comfort to Jamie. Of course, it was to be non-judgmental, but it was still to elicit information. So a little bit more like the forensic interviewer's role. quite far from the therapist role. And perhaps that's what made her cry too at the end, because it is heartbreaking when he says, "Do you like me?" What do you say to a young 13-year-old who so helplessly asks you a question like that? And her professional boundaries prevented her from really responding to a question like that. I also want to say that when we think about what is being done in other countries, exemplars from there, what we want to emulate or how. And of course, we would like some of these separations and specialist functions someday in our country. It's also important to keep in mind where you are. Were you to pursue this kind of interviewing technique that Brioni shows, even in a therapeutic context? If you look at what Dr. Shekhar described to be a constructive confrontational approach, it draws essentially from cognitive behavioral approaches, therapeutic approaches from CBT. But if you were to do them with a child who is dysregulated, can be aggressive, whether it is in a clinic setup or it's in a residential home setup, etc., you may have noticed that there's a good amount of security provided. And that becomes an important consideration, because when the interview is of a nature where you're pushing a child almost relentlessly, persisting with it till the child answers, and there are likely many kids would be far more dysregulated than Jamie, and become extremely aggressive. So this kind of interviewing has to be done with great caution. And as I was also telling my team, I would not do this so easily in the setups that we have. And one could draw certain types of questions, or as Dr. Shekhar pointed out, there are several themes that one could focus the interview on, either for assessment or intervention purpose. But whether that could be embedded more in a context of therapy, using gentler methods of validation, reflection, etc. Because let's face it, in our country, we don't have these systems of security, not in our clinics, not in our inpatient facilities, certainly, where we are not necessarily meant to, but not in setups like the observation home either. So I think this is a judicious mix of what would be technically important to understand and use for assessment and intervention, but also the settings that we work in, the kind of infrastructure that we have in our country. So those are some thoughts for you to consider in terms of what is appropriate and what to use.
I think the whole UK system, both Dr. Mirza and Dr. Sita have pointed out how the UK system works. Something for reporting to the court, and then there is therapy. And Sheila, like you said, there are separate processes. The psychologist's job here was not as a therapist, it was to provide a report to the court. And of course, Sita points out that a lot of stuff is kind of dramatized, though all the processes are accurate, because ultimately it's a drama series. Some of the things have been dramatized, and there are some technical issues here. But Radhika, thank you for also putting down the list of content that the psychologist alluded to in what she was trying to elicit, from Jamie. Now, what happened in episode 3 was also 3 parts of Jamie's temperament, shall we say, his emerging personality, his demeanor and deportment that came. One part was kind of almost flirtatious with the psychologist. The other was this rage and anger, the shoving things and yelling and saying things like, "Don't talk to me like that," and then there was a third part which was plaintive, finally when he says, "Do you really like me as a person?" This vulnerable 13-year-old that he actually is. So almost like these are three parts of a character, that there are 3 facets of his temperament and his identity, probably accentuated by the kind of processes that he was enduring and experiencing in the months and years that preceded the act that took place, independent of what Sandeep Nayak says about evidence and who pushed who. All of that is there. But if you really look at the background of these facets of Jamie's identity and look at what that means in terms of mental health considerations and mental health frameworks, both from what a psychologist can do, what a therapist can do, caregiving and parenting mean in this kind of era. And many people have raised the question of Indian children. Alina, for example, says, how about Indian children coping with borderless digital exposure? Uh, and there are many issues that have been raised about how we can apply this to our context. And there's a reason why we are stating this, friends. One of the reasons why we also wanted to put out this event today is there are increasingly a number of newspaper reports from India about violent crimes uh, perpetrated by individuals below the age of 18. And there is an increasing concern about what this phenomena is. And therefore, this discussion today is quite timely to address the kind of issues that we have so far been talking about. And any ideas that you have, you could please start putting that on chat and we'll respond to that as we go along.
And while you do that, let's move to the last theme that we have today on caregiving and parenting in the era of toxic internet subcultures and social media. What does all this really mean for parents? And just to get you started on the thinking as you think with us and put your thoughts and comments out there. If you look at the Miller family and the kind of grief that they felt and that went on and on, it appeared to be a mixture of grief, of sadness, of absolute confusion and perplexity as to how did this all happen? 7 months on, that's what Mr. and Mrs. Miller are still sort of thinking, what did we do? And their statement of, but we made him. And perhaps the inner voice there is, how did we make him like this? When we also have a daughter, made her very differently. But how did we make him this way? So I draw your attention to the grief issue in this family, because a lot of when events like this happen or incidents like this take place, society tends to be largely judgmental. And you know how the first thing that everybody says is, oh, exactly what Dr. Prafulla is saying. Were they permissive in their parenting style? And, did they, spoiled child, didn't get the right values at home, and on, too much money, too little money, and so on. But I think this series makes the point that parents, it's not necessarily that way. Parents may be to quote unquote to blame. Certainly there may be things that they haven't done right, but there are also many situations, many children where parents have done their utmost or parents have no idea what has gone on, and how parents feel thereafter. And I think it's interesting that the series really try to turn the spotlight on parents who are absolutely helpless in a situation like this, believing that they have reasonably done the right thing. No parent is perfect. Parenting is probably the hardest thing in the world to do. How do you get it right? How do you know you've got it right? How do you know when you're not getting it right? These are questions that I think parents grapple with all the time. And I think for those of you on this group who are parents, I'm sure you felt it many times that parenting is not just difficult, but sometimes it feels like an existentialist crisis. Like, I don't know what to do and where to go from here. I don't know what the right response is. I don't know what to say. Maybe it doesn't matter whether I say it or don't say it. It's still going to carry on in this manner. And yet, for parents, in as judgmental as the world may be, deep inside, parents are wondering what they have done or not done. So your comments on parenting, on the parents in this series, but parenting in general in relation to this internet era, and what it means, and what Saurabh was saying, what does it feel like to be co-parenting with the internet? That's really, I think, what this is about. Look at what parents have to contend with and who they are competing with. So we welcome your comments on that, and I think they've begun.
As the comments are coming in, there's also this point about why did Jamie choose the father as the accompanying person, why not the mother? And I go back to the point again that Dr. Mirza had raised about, remember the father spoke about how brutally he was beaten by his own father by a belt, and he swore to himself he would never hit his son. But on the other hand, if you really look at episode 4 and you look at the nature of the interaction between the father and the mother, he was respectful, very loving, but there was a dynamic there where the mother was by personality submissive, not a very assertive kind of person, and there was a not an undermining, but a kind of brushing aside, I suppose, of many things that she tried to say because of the kind of anger, unresolved anger that he had. And a lot of people are putting that down. In fact, Dr. Deepanjali says that Eddie Miller tried to manage his anger, but most of the time he felt disappointed rather than showing his emotion. But I wonder whether one of the reasons why Jamie actually chose the father was because they have witnessed this dynamic in the family, and they know he probably knew that the father would be more assertive, or he knew how manifest and organic the father's love for him was. And the father's grief is that much more compounded because of the intensity of the organic love that he has for the child, and then add to that the confusion he had about, but we made him, and how did he come out this way? So that's the kind of the father in episode 4 is a mirror image of Jamie in episode 3. That's an interesting observation, Mirza. So yeah,
Dr. Suchita raises an interesting question. Perhaps you all want to consider this one. The father stops speaking to him when Jamie says he's going to change his plea. That's when Jamie wants to plead guilty. It seems he doesn't want Jamie to take accountability for his actions. It is an interesting question because, and you wonder why. I don't know whether one could, in all fairness, say that this is the kind of father who's really antisocial, an example to Jamie that, don't follow the rules, don't follow the law. In fact, the father's a regular, reasonably law abiding person going about his business. But on the other hand, did he want Jamie to be different? Or was it more because he was hoping somewhere that all this wasn't true? This horrible nightmare that was playing out. And, this is some form of denial where he hopes that it'll all work itself out. And as long as Jamie doesn't plead guilty, that's also a possibility, and as long as he pleads that he's innocent, that somehow people will be convinced, and we'll just get past this. To me, that's possibly more likely than his actively wanting Jamie to be dishonest, because he doesn't seem like that kind of guy, at least not really.
Yeah, Dr. Saini, we know our intention was not to make people feel helpless. Really, I feel that a lot of stuff discussed in this, we hope that it would be empowering in the work that you do to nuance some of the way that you approach it, and you orient yourself so that you have a sense of efficacy in the way that you deal with children and adolescents who are just as involved in this.
And I think, as Dr. Galgali says, there is always room for communication and connection. You recall the scene in episode 2 where the detectives, the police or the detective, his son reaches out to him and says, "Dad, I want to talk to you." And he actually comes and explains things to him. So there's obviously room for that kind of thing. And a lot depends on the kind of communication that parents model. Because if you look at Eddie Miller and you recall the first episode, he is supportive of the child. He goes in, tries to be supportive, but when he finds that the child, the child is, there's evidence to show that he's guilty, then he simply falls silent. Perhaps that's where the dialogue should have continued. And the series doesn't show very much about what the communication patterns are between father and son. We don't know that. But if you look at typical families, traditional Indian families especially, recall how little fathers often say, how little they may engage in situations that are fraught and emotional. Very similar to what you saw in some ways in this series also. And think of our own childhoods, our own families, and the number of times we've had to convey things through our mothers to our fathers, and the message comes around the same way. Father says to mother, "Tell her this," or "Tell him that." So it's not just about a presence or absence of communication. It is also, we have to look at communication patterns in a family in a more nuanced manner. Who communicates with who, how, and in what situations. Fathers come into play very often, and these are all gendered. Is it about making decisions about college? Is it about finance? Is it about US politics? Who's going to be president? Stuff like that. Then dad's there. But bad report card, issues at school, issues with friends, then not my department, somebody else deal with it. I'm not saying that every family is that way, but if you look at the nonverbal culture, families in general in India, and the kind of communication that mothers and fathers engage in typically in various situations, these are the kind of things that play out. And whether parenting means, it's not just about empathy in general, whether parenting means changing communication patterns within a family between different individuals and drawing mothers and fathers into more egalitarian patterns of communication with their children. If a mother can talk to her daughter about sexuality, why can't a father? So stuff like that is probably, so maybe we need to be more nuanced in the parenting workshops we do, and move beyond some of these banalities, dare I say, as legitimate as they are, about just communication and pressure and so on. Who are we talking about here? So maybe we need to have some serious conversations with mothers and fathers and ask them really, it would be an interesting research study to do. What do you communicate to your child about? If you asked mothers and fathers and actually did the comparison on it to see who communicates about what and on what issues and how these things play out, because it is those relationships and patterns that children witness up close and personal, and that's what they're drawing from. And to go back to the question that someone asked on why did Jamie choose his father when he was asked to choose a person to be with him, whether that also then came from a perception that he would be the stronger person to have with him. that he would be able to defend him better and that his mother would not be able to do something like that. Now, how much of that comes from his own observation of his family, and how much of that comes from his ideologies that relate to the manosphere and, all the masculine ideologies? It's possibly a mix of the two.
Just to bring it back to some of what we've already spoken about, but this point about a narrative and a counter narrative is extremely important, especially when you consider that the manosphere is not just the most extreme versions of misogyny. There are also less extreme versions of misogyny. There are different kinds of more casual forms of sexism on chat forums and so on. And it's so in a sense it really is an ecology, because it has different spectrums of hate and violence and content that engages violence and so on. But the alternative that we spoke about, in terms of when you look at it from a parenting perspective, of course, at one level, no person, even if it's the family, can counter the barrage of hateful or extremely harmful content that sometimes exists. But important conversations can be had if there is space for it to be had. For example, this is quite a few years ago. This was a friend's parent that I distinctly remember in a conversation with me and few others, was confronted with someone basically saying that I don't believe some of the things I read, but some women really can't drive. And so this friend's parent looks at this group of children, amongst whom one person has said that some women really can't drive, and the parent responded, with very simple points. Say, how many times have you seen one of your parents driving a car yell at somebody? And everyone said, reasonably, of course, we've all seen that at some point. How many of those incidents were typically men driving? And then everyone said they were always men driving. So by that token, if most of the time you seem to be getting into scuffles on the road with men being involved, what does that tell you about some women not being able to drive? And it was a really simple point, but the point was that it facilitated perspective, right? When children learn these things in schools or learn these things in an online capacity and come home to discuss some of these things, how can gentle forms of persuasion or gentle forms of perspective giving, perspective taking really help mitigate even the everyday instances of issues that may come up?
Just quickly to add on to what Saurav said, very interlinked in terms of parenting and what to do, how to do it, right? A lot of times why children start accessing some of these subcultures, right, like the manosphere that we talked about, is because of trying to find answers to questions wherein there is a very logical explanation from the manosphere, which is appealing, but obviously not very factually or not very scientifically correct, right? Or not even correct by the tenets of larger justice and righteousness, right? For example, a question like, why should women sports persons be paid the equal amount of money when their performances compared to men are always inferior? Let's say, for example, their 100-meter record is always going to be inferior to that of a man's 100-meter record, right? And these questions which children start forming at a very young age, or because of access and exposure to media per se, the point is, at a point in time, parents or at least someone suitable doesn't step in to answer these questions in the larger interest of justice, in the larger interest of factual accuracy, etc. Children are likely to access somebody like Andrew Tate, who will have an explanation for this, have a video for this, but will initially start explaining it in a logical, giving the same logic which the child already has already started thinking about, and then take it to more extreme forms, and that's how they get more into the manosphere and get entrapped there, right? So therefore these are smaller things, but smaller conversations which act as protective factors for them not to go further and further into the manosphere, right?
Well, I'd just like to also quickly acknowledge the comments put by Lakshmi Shanti, Jeena, Shalini Basin, Divya Gulati, Ravi Bhargav, Grace, Mausami, Dr. Ajay Kumar, Sangeeta Karan, Samita Agarwal, Nina David, Aditi, Bhavnish Saini, and Yashika. Thank you very much for your comments. Go back to a comment made by Nina David, which is, parenting cannot be a manualized process. And Samvad has actually been very interested in the whole issue of parenting. Just to remind you, when we started our operations smack at the start of the pandemic in 2020, one of the first series that we did was called Parenting Pathshala. Not that we looked specifically at this kind of complex and contentious issue. We looked at various aspects of parenting. From a public child mental health perspective, one of our ideas has been to try and take responsive parenting into the community through what we believed would be a robust panchayat kind of a model. Sambad believes very strongly in working with public systems. Also, we are reminded of the very famous line in Ben-Hur, this Hollywood blockbuster, when Judah Ben-Hur, played by Charlton Heston, is becoming very powerful, and Mesala, played by Stephen Boyd, asks, "How do you fight an idea?" And he says, "You fight an idea with another idea." So we cannot wish the digital world, the virtual world away. And I think we need to use it basically in some ways to address, to counter, to subvert the problematic or toxic messages about men and women, about people, about relationships that are given rise to and then propagated in the media, and in a scenario where there is really no culture of conversations between children and families, how these ideas then structure their notions about people and relationships. So to be able to use the media strategically to fight some of these problematic beliefs is what we hope to do going ahead in the next phase of work that we are likely to launch into. So these are some thoughts that we wanted to express, and I think the fact that at least 150 people have stayed on the program, I think, is an indication of your deep interest, not just in this area, but your deep commitment and concern for the predicament of the contemporary adolescent. So these are some thoughts that I wanted to express, and if anyone else would like to say something, we will then take those thoughts and then close the session.
Right. Anything?
Yeah, just I think after the discussion we've had, it's a little bit heavy today. So it seems that, almost that it's a David versus Goliath situation. It's hard to contest what's happening with social media, but it's not impossible to address, I think. And I think it was a social psychologist who once said that for every complex problem, there's an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And so the imperative, therefore, I think, is for nuance. And if for the likes of Andrew Tate, who say things like the man has to struggle to earn, the man has to suffer so that the woman can be provided for, and the woman will take care of the home. These are not difficult people to address. These are not difficult perspectives to beat, because the answer is always that, but you don't have to live in that world, because if you had equality with your partner, then the man doesn't have to struggle, and neither one of you have to struggle in the same way. So I think, there are ways these can be addressed, but the question is, how do we make space for adolescents to feel like they're able to actually discuss some of these problems, and how do we create a space where we're not kept aloof from what's happening on these platforms?
Right.
There are indeed so many lenses through which we can view a film, and I think 2 hours is not sufficient really for the many more perspectives that many people would have had. The purpose, I want to say as we close today, the purpose of today's discussion was really discussion. Samvad did not actually aim to provide any answers. So as Dr. Bhavish said, I feel a little helpless. I often tell people when we do a program at Sambad, our purpose is not to provide clear answers, or at least not all the time. Our purpose is really to have everyone reflect, and reflect not necessarily to simplify, because that would indeed be reductionist, but to reflect in ways that study a problem in all its complexity and in its many, many dimensions. So I hope that this afternoon has been an opportunity for us all to reflect on some of what the series threw up, to look at what other people had to say about it. And so we are really grateful for everybody's contributions to this afternoon. And we hope that we'll be able to run more sessions of this nature, because I always believe, and as does my team, I think dialogue and conversation is more important than a training program that everyone so loves to do, because it has a beginning, middle, and conclusion. So stay with us, keep thinking, and let's keep talking. Thank you very much on behalf of all of us at Samvad, and have a wonderful Saturday evening. Thank you.
Thank you.